We're going to take a little more extended look at Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 21. Because this is a longer text, we'll break up the presentation into several shorter segments. But before we do that, it's worth our spending just a moment to get a little bit of a sense of the literary issues surrounding this particular text, at least some of the issues, particularly those that relate to how this text fits into its context. That'll help us to see how we can read it a little more intelligently. So, first, a couple of literary issues. Genesis chapters 1 to 11 contain two major narrative blocks. Those narrative blocks are chapters 2 to 4, essentially, the narrative of the fall, and chapters 6 to 9, essentially, the narrative of the flood. These two are divided by a genealogy in chapter 5 that serves to fast forward the action, another genealogy in chapter 10 which serves to fast forward the action until we arrive at the patriarchal narratives, and then a brief transitional account, the Tower of Babel account, before we move into the patriarchal narratives. But as it relates to these two major narrative blocks, we should observe that they have the same basic structure. Each begins with a section that gives us a picture of what things are like before the main action of the narrative happens. This is followed by the main action, here called the focal event. And then there's an aftermath part of the narrative that shows us how things are different after the focal event or the main event in the narrative. Now, the point of a text that's structured like this is to draw a contrast between the setting and the aftermath so that you can see the effect that the main event or the focal event has had. By seeing the contrast between the situation before and the situation after, we learn the significance of that main event within the narrative itself. As it relates to the narrative of the fall, the setting is chapter 2, verses 4 to 25, the description of what life was like in the garden before the fall. The aftermath narrative is essentially chapter 4, which focuses on the rise and spread of violence in the human community after the fall. And the focal event, chapter 3, is what we'll be reading in our text, and of course it's the narrative of the fall itself. As far as chapter 3 is concerned, let's take a quick look at how it's put together. The first 7 verses give us the basic event. This is followed by the encounter with God, verses 8 to 13, which flows directly into the spoken pronouncement of judgment upon the serpent first, and then upon the woman, verse 16, and then upon Adam, verses 17 to 19. The chapter ends with a very brief addendum, I think we might describe it, which describes or gives us some of the consequences. So one consequence, the first thing that we're given, is that Adam gives his wife a name. She'd always simply been the woman before in the narrative, and now she is given a name, Hawa, and we'll talk about that when we get there. The second thing is that God makes clothing for them. This is connected to what will happen in the narrative when they make clothing for themselves. And it represents the fact that despite the fall and their disobedience and God's judgment upon them, God hasn't abandoned care for his creation entirely. And then the last part is the banishment, the actual expulsion from the garden itself. So with those very few things in mind, as relates to the structure of this passage, both in its context and within itself. We'll turn now to reading the first section of this, the narrative of the disobedience, verses 1 to 7.